I had a little voice interference there, so I'll just ignore it. Talking about media, in today's world, we are totally embedded in a media world. We're almost saturated in it. So that's almost become very much part of us. And it seems almost as if it's kind of everyday and common sense, and in a sense, very much part of our everyday ritual. Whether we listen to music or whether we love to watch films or engage in social media in all its forms, or even if we like to look at paintings, because they're all, if you like, channels of communication, and we are surrounded with this all the time. So why is it important to study media? Well, in this very first module, I like students to become aware, first and foremost, of this whole idea around communication. Because if you think about it, communication is at the heart of our everyday experience, whether it comes to formal, informal, one-to-one, intimate conversations, or indeed communicating with family members or institutions. So communication is essential. So I would hope to spark all you students in terms of becoming very aware of how you communicate, because it's not just the words we use when we are speaking, but it's also using our body to communicate. So we're starting off introducing this notion of communication to situate you in it, so that you become very aware of how you communicate and the words you select to communicate. And this all happens at a very kind of unconscious level, if you like. So what you learn in this module is to slow down the whole communication process. And in doing that, we learn to become more aware. So what do we cover then in this module? Well, we talk a bit about communication first in terms of the fact that it's very dynamic, it calls forth a response. We talk about individual communication, and indeed we talk about the intercommunication that goes on within our heads, because we have this continuous voice going on in our heads. And in a sense, the media is competing with this constant internal monologue that goes on in our heads. So they have to work very, very hard, and they are masters of their work, if you like, in terms of presenting us with information. So when we think about the media, we have to think of it in terms of mass communication. And mass communication really is speaking to one and everybody at the same time. And as you can imagine, in this world, we can't kind of call it this, well, we can call it an information age, but we always have to remember that all information isn't always available to everybody. And we can't also assume that, this technology that we are using more and more to communicate, to engage with friends, to engage with family, to engage within work, with students, etc., we can't assume that everybody has the wherewithal to purchase this expensive technology. So we have to be very mindful of that when we talk about inclusion. So media, when we look, I suppose, at communication, it's always traveling along some sort of channel. Now, in the early days, when communication didn't even become, wasn't even a topic, wasn't even considered, we had the telephone. And some of the various interested people, coming from logicians, coming from mathematicians, philosophers, they were looking at communication, but they were talking about the phone. So they gave us these really very early models of communication, which work a bit like the railway model of communication. In other words, this idea that you can package a piece of communication, decide what you're going to say, send it along a particular channel, and assume it will arrive in the way you intended. So, as you can imagine, those very early models of communication were looking at the telephone, and they were looking at how they could improve communication. So, they came up with a couple of different concepts that they argued, and indeed a lot of scholars have argued, that they can be applied to any form of communication, but they are with their limitations. And when they started off, a group called Shannon and Weaver introduced this communication model, and it talked about this idea of improving the efficiency of communication. Now, efficiency is always important, and as you can imagine, uh, um, you know, efficiency in terms of even how we use technology is important. So, if you like, media studies came along and it built on these very early models of communication. So, scholars came along and they introduced this notion of feedback. They came along and introduced this notion of perception and interpretation and selection. So each, if you like, contributing theorists like Shannon and Weaver, like Laswell, like Newcomb, and I don't want to name them all for you because I just want to kind of get you into the mode of thinking about where communication all started, or where communication studies all started. So that is sort of one school of thought in terms of seeing communication as a railway model of communication. But there was huge limitations to this, especially when we try and apply it to the type of communications that we are faced with today. So we have another school of thought, and this is to do with linguistics, and it's called semiotics, and it's the study of signs. And in semiotics, everything is a sign. So when you look around you, even right now when you are looking, you have various signs in front of you. In other words, you have various objects or scripts, or people or sounds that are all communicating something. So here we are getting much closer to this idea of looking at media in terms not just as an institution communicating something to us, but rather we're looking at kind of a three-part, if you like, triangle, where you have the text, the media text, be that a film, or be it a newspaper article, a magazine article, or a series on television, or indeed an advertisement. So they're all communicating something, and they all have something to say. So in semiotics, we talk about the text, as I've just mentioned. We talk about the channel in which it is being communicated. And we also talk about the producer of the text. In other words, the creator of the text, be it a director or be it a journalist. And then we talk about the audience. So, if you like, in semiotics, when you're looking at different forms of media, the meaning doesn't lie in the actual text itself, but it lies in your interaction with it, and that, if you like, is where meaning comes. So in semiotics, it's not that we're just looking at what something means, because when we see an advertisement for something like a bottle of perfume, uh, excuse me, we know the advertisement is selling a bottle of perfume, okay, at a basic level. We know what it's doing. When we look at a film, we know what the film is about. But when we are doing semiotic analysis, we look at how they arrived at the particular meaning, or how they put the meaning together. And this is really important, and it's really useful, even in terms of our own communication process, because we're not always very aware of the words we select when we are talking. Because they just we just flow and they just come out of our mouth. And sometimes in those words we choose, ideologies can be carried in them. So ideologies can be carried in discourse, and discourse really is to do with how we talk about something. So for example, there's there's different ways of talking about women. There's different ways of talking about men. There's different ways of talking about crime, about drug abusers, about poverty. But sometimes in society, it's because it's the very powerful, in other words, those institutions, those media corporations that have the power and the wherewithal to communicate messages. And I'm sure, society has to be kept in order. There has to be a certain amount of social order. And because we're living, if you like, in a very materialistic corporate world, the idea of the media speaking to a particular audience, as you can imagine, they want their audience to be a certain type. And traditionally, I say, and thank goodness this is changing, but of course change takes very little time. It's very slow. So in talking about this idea of how they communicate, what sort of discourses do they offer to audiences? In other words, what points of view are they offering? And sometimes they are catering for a middle class audience. So what we have is that lots of people get left out or get ignored, or we don't hear their voices in the media. So when you're looking at films or series, I don't know what your interests are. Maybe you like rap music, maybe you like Eminem, maybe you like films on Netflix, or maybe you're on social media. I'm not sure, but regardless, it's all media. And how you communicate and how the media communicate to you, you always have to ask yourselves, am I included in this way of talking? So take, for example, we have an ethnic group in Ireland called the Travellers. There's a little box popping up here now. I just want to get rid of it. We have an ethnic group of travellers in our society, in our country, and indeed in other countries. And they're travellers and they like to travel around. And if you were to ask, and I do this every year with my students, if I were to ask you, and I have done it, how do you feel about travellers? Give me one word to describe them. And 89 or 99% will always give a negative response. Yet, the majority will have had absolutely no experience of this particular group. So where do they get their ideas from? And that leads us into a very big question in terms of how do we know what we know? How do we know what we know about people? How do we know what we know about different cultures? How do we know what we know about different events? It all comes from the media. And so, with my very first point in this lecture, I said we were embedded or saturated in a media environment that has become so naturalized that it's almost everything they say is common sense. And the problem is that this shapes us, this shapes our worldview, and in turn, it then influences how we treat people in society. Uh, um, so, in this module, we learn how to analyze texts to see what sort of discourses they are operating. And we also look at a couple of different things that are kind of interesting, I suppose. We look at narrative, the story of narrative, and why is narrative important to look at? Now, narrative is the technical term that we use in academia for story, and we all tell stories, and we all like telling stories, and equally the media tells stories as well. But what kind of stories do they tell? Who is included in these stories, and maybe who is left out of these stories? So we might look at social media or any media text at all, and we might say to ourselves, uh, um, uh, what type of people are we seeing? Society consists of all different types and shapes of people. Um, think of think about the advertisements you are exposed to. Very often, they're not just selling the old bottle of perfume or the shower gel or the whitening toothpaste. They are selling a lifestyle. And the problem is when we get a continuum of this these type of media texts, we come to accept that in order to be in the world, to be part of the world, to be included, we have to look like this. So we are constantly images are being held up to us. Beautiful people with perfect teeth, with perfect body shapes. And we always have to ask ourselves, well, where do I fit in that? Because we can't all be like that. But the problem is when we are exposed to so many of these images, we can't help at some level thinking that they are the norm, and or this is the way to be. So if you think of your, maybe I don't know whether you're on social media or not, but many of the students are on Facebook here in the college, or indeed Instagram, and they create narratives about themselves every single day when they go on their social media sites. And the photographs they put up, and remember, they don't just pick kind of a random series of photographs, or they don't randomly describe some event they were at, be it a skating competition or a surfing competition or whatever it may be, a game of bridge or whatever. Uh, uh, you don't randomly select. You make choices. I'll put this up. I won't put that photo up. So you make all these decisions. Why? Because you are creating a narrative, a story about yourself, and your photographs tell a story about you. So in terms of your social media, if you use it, you learn how to read photographs. You learn about narrative. You learn about story. You learn about the different techniques that media professionals use. So they have all sorts of techniques. So if they want, if you're producing a film, or a play or whatever, a podcast, whatever it might be, you want to get a particular message across, don't you? You have something to say, and so you don't just get to say it, but you also get to show it. And in producing a show like that, you have to make all sorts of choices, and we do that all the time in our communication. And you know, I suppose in media studies, and particularly in semiotics, when we do semiotic analysis, you know, do you ever find if you go to the cinema and you come out of the cinema and you're chatting to your friends, and you know, you might say something about the film and somebody might say to you, that's not what it's about. You're not getting it. You know, you don't understand it. So you can't allow people to say that to you, because you are coming to your particular viewing process. You're coming to making your TikTok, or writing on your Facebook, or whatever it may be, or taking your photograph. You are coming as an individual who has a whole load of stuff, if you like, that is part of you. So you have your gender, you have your age, you have your socioeconomic status. You also have your geographical location. You have your culture, you have your age, you have your emotional state, your mental state. So all these are coming into play when we communicate, but equally when we read a text. Now, when I say read in media studies, I mean you can read any kind of text, you can read a photograph. So semiotics is our kind of basic toolkit that we use in order to analyze any kind of media at all, regardless of the type of channel it is, or the genre, or the category of media. So in looking at narrative, we very quickly we look at various films. Obviously, we can't look at them all during the lectures, but nonetheless, we always show film clips, so that you'll get an idea of what we're about. And I suppose when you're analyzing and you're getting theory, it's always very important that you learn how to apply the theory. There's no point just learning a theory and not being able to apply it. So that's what you get. You get kind of a toolkit, if you like. And in gaining that toolkit, you learn, which is kind of, you know, it kind of builds our self-esteem when we understand films, because there are some obscure films out there. There are some rather dense writing in newspaper articles. So having a toolkit helps you not just to see how meaning is put together, but also to understand what type of words have been chosen in order to put a piece of media together. So in looking at narrative, and that's just one thing we're looking at, we look at how stories are produced, how they are put together, and all the, if you like, the devices that producers use when producing a film. So we look at camera style, because there's different types of camera styles, camera shots. For example, the close-up shot has always traditionally been used in documentary style, but now I suppose we're seeing more and more of the close-up shot in our everyday viewing of films as well, and the purpose of it is to show emotion. Uh, um, so all these little tricks that they have in order to not just tell us, but also show us. We also examine how everything you see on the screen. So when you are looking at a film, and I'm assuming you are film viewers, and maybe you're not. So, but I'm just coming up with examples. You may like to look at photographs. You may like to look at paintings. It doesn't really matter what medium, if you like. The techniques all apply. So we look at mise en scène, which is really what's on the stage. So when you look at your screen, the director has placed, or the set designer, I suppose, has placed every single object, has decorated a scene, if you like, so that every object regardless of how small it is, communicates something. Because it's not just the words, it's the visuals, but it's also our body language, and indeed the body language of characters and our clothes. And I always like to bring examples from the particular first. So when you get up in the morning, you choose and select from various paradigms of clothing to put yourself together. Now, this may happen in a rush, it may happen unconsciously, but nonetheless, I think when you slow down communication, and here I'm talking about dressing in order to present yourself, we start to think about our choices. So not only does our voice communicate something about us, the tone of voice we use. If I were to give you an example of one sentence, you could interpret it in many different ways depending on my tone of voice. So tone of voice, my pitch, whether I use my hands, whether I've good eye contact or not, whether I fold my arms, whatever it may be, my body language is always communicating something about me, as are my clothes. So if you can imagine then going from that particular onto and put yourself in front of a screen, and you want to, if you like, reinforce whatever idea it is that you want to get across in film. For example, we use a film called Cardboard Gangsters. I'm not sure whether you've seen that or not, but it was an art house film made in 2014, and the script writer and one of the actors was called Mike Connors, and Mike Connors is actually a traveller. And this film is raw. It's, and some might turn away from the rawness of it. It has a lot of upsetting scenes, it's quite violent, but nonetheless, it communicates using visuals, using words and costume and particular types of cars, particular types of scenery, of locations. And every one of those contribute, every last detail in that film contributes to the overall meaning of the film, which is we all have choices, but sometimes for some people choices are very complex. Sometimes in life you hear, people can be disparaging and can be judgmental when looking at people with maybe addiction problems, and they may make judgments like, well, there's plenty of help out there if they want to get it. Sort of, and coming from a very middle class seat, it's insensitive, but it's also ignorant, and that's just one example of one of the films that we look at that shows the complexity involved in making choices for some individuals in society. And the group in this particular film are living in a very neglected city area, and they have nothing and nobody cares, basically, and they get involved in drugs. So it's a very kind of insightful film, and anything you are engaging in, regardless of what you're watching, every last detail is important, and we analyze all that. And okay, so that's looking at narrative, and of course we also look at how time is managed. If you think about it, a film can encompass 17 years, but it's only, we only have an hour and a half viewing time, so that 17 years, if you like, needs techniques in order for it to be delivered to an hour and a half or 2 hours viewing time. So we look also at rhetoric, and rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Now, sometimes persuasion has kind of, negative connotations, with this idea of kind of manipulation. So we want to kind of get rid of those negative connotations. And connotations, if you're not familiar with the word, is to do with the meanings that we add to something. So we don't go around the place saying, this is such and such a character, or this is a camera. We add meaning all the time, and we're constantly doing this. So rhetoric is about how the media manage to create a particular meaning from a particular text. In other words, what do they utilize? So obviously, in newspapers, you have things like alliteration. So in some of maybe the tabloid newspapers, you might have some kind of catchy sort of rhyming type of headlines, and a lot of the time they may be sensationalist. Whereas if you look at the broadsheets, they will have their own particular style as well. And of course, they work from the pyramid article. So in the first paragraph, you always get to know who, where, what, where, and why, and that's the style they use. And also in soap operas, if you watch them, they have a particular style as well, in terms of making sure you watch again next week. And there's camera styles. In the same way, if you're creating a poster, which is a piece of communication, you're going to choose words, but you're also going to choose, a font size, or you're going to choose a color scheme. All these things work on you. Think of some of the great speeches that have been delivered down through the years. The ones that have made impressions on people, and that people go back to time and time again. Okay, so that's narrative. We also look at, so that's rhetoric. So we also look at narrative, and we also look at genre. In other words, in terms of news, and in particular, photojournalism. Now, every year I change it. I get a kind of good idea of what students like. Maybe they like news, maybe they like horror, maybe they like science fiction, or gritty drama. So I change it about a good bit. So this term I'm doing news, and in particular photojournalism, because again, we are saturated with images. Can any of you kind of, even in your head, just do a quick think? Can you remember any items from news that kind of struck a chord with you, or that you can remember? Like, remember the little boy that was washed up on the beach in Greece, I think it was. Some of you are nodding your heads, so you might be familiar with that. But the big question is, are you familiar with the story, or what happened, or what it was about? And you see, because of the ubiquitous nature, if you like, of the media, we are getting images at such an immediate effect delivered into our screens. And I suppose with the COVID, we've had to be on screens all the time to connect with friends, to study, to learn, etc., etc. So we've become very much stuck to our screens, and hopefully we'll come out of that soon. So in terms of these images that are coming in, and sometimes, of course, uninvited, because when you click on various sites on the net, your data is being collected, and they're very kind of sophisticated algorithms now. to send you stuff. You know, you might have looked up a particular item and then suddenly you're getting all sorts of stuff. And I'm sure you've noticed that. And it can be quite annoying. So sometimes I suppose we're exposed to media that we do not ask for. So it's very much in our face. So if you think of, I suppose we kind of look at news in terms of news as a genre, because news has really changed. As you can imagine, it has changed with technology. I mean, traditionally we had the TV news and we had the newspaper news, but now we have the internet news. And a lot of the time they're sound bites. So when we hear or when we see images of Palestine, of Israel, of Russia, of famines, of various very catastrophic events around the world, we're just getting images. So we look a bit, obviously, at news first, so that you get a handle on how news is presented and how it has changed. And news was traditionally very, very formal, but now it's become a lot chattier, and it has changed with technology. Now we're getting more and more just sound bites. So if we want to know more, we have to, we might have to go on to the BBC News to find out about very complex situations like Israel and Palestine. And a lot of the time we're going around and we don't know what's happening. And now almost our information is being replaced with visuals. So in terms of looking on visuals, we ask ourselves the question, have we the right to look on people who are very vulnerable? And is it exploitation? Because we are getting so many images, do we become almost desensitized to the suffering? Do we become voyeuristic? Like peeping Toms looking on people's pain? Or do we need the visuals to activate us? Think of Band-Aid. I don't know whether you're familiar with Band-Aid, Live Aid, Bob Geldof. You may not be, but that he's a musician, and when the images of the Ethiopian famine were coming into his sitting room as he sat in his comfortable chair, he was activated or galvanized into act. Now he had the wherewithal to do that and to do the Live Aid and raise millions and millions. But nonetheless, we can't sit back and say, should we, how we couldn't do that, but we can do it in a small way. So the thing is, do these images, these horrendous images, which I always show, and I might actually include one or two on my slides for you, some of the more famous ones, if you like. So I'm putting famous in inverted commas because I don't like that term, because it even sounds like exploitation. So looking at these images, does it galvanize? Do they serve a purpose? And every year students say, yes, 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 we need to see what's happening. But in seeing, do we put our hands in our pockets? Are we galvanized to doing some sort of event? Or do we become just swamped because there's so many of them? So there's all sorts of perspectives, obviously, you can take on that. And what of the people being photographed? Do we know their names? Are they asked if their photographs can be taken? So we do quite a lot on that, and students generally love that. And even if it gets you thinking, I suppose, even if it gets you thinking and creating an awareness. So we do an exploration of that, and we look at some theories, obviously, of course, on it. And then we also look at representation. And representation is to do with how people, places, events are, and I hyphenate the word. So instead of saying represented, I use the term represented in the media. So who gets represented, how are they represented. So if you think of society, we have people with all sorts of different impairments, physically, mentally, and so society consists of all types. So do we see all types in the media? Are we seeing perfect people? I show a video. I've shown a video for the last 2 years, and I'll show it again this year. It's a short film, and I had a job to find one, and it's about this young 14-year-old boy who's living with his dad. The mum left, and it's about him coming to terms with his sexuality and his father having huge difficulties around it. So because he has Down syndrome, many people assume just because somebody has Down syndrome that they don't have the same needs as we have. So the film explores this in a very sensitive, gentle way, and it's a For Dorian, it's called. It's a very beautiful short film. It's only 16.5 minutes long. So we explore that, and you see, in showing films, in using cardboard gangsters, like I said, in using, in other words, having practical working films, in using For Dorian, we learn to apply the theories and test them out to see how they work. Because, oh, I just heard something, sorry. Is that a message coming from me? No, 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 I'm okay, all right. Is it okay? Yeah, it's okay? Yeah, okay. So, what, pardon? No,
is
you're okay?
Okay?
It's just another student who came in, don't worry.
Okay.
We're getting more students.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, so I was talking about this notion of representation and kind of the politics around representation. Who gets to talk, who's left out, and this representing the world, our world to us. We have to ask ourselves: do we recognize ourselves in this world? Who is this text? Who is this film speaking to? Is it just the few, maybe middle class, special audience, or who is it? So if you think about why might we look at the politics of representation? Well, we have a lot of comedy, don't we? And we have a lot of documentaries, and we have a lot of war films, and we have a lot of soaps, and we have lots of other things. And sometimes there's a value judgment made on people who watch, who watch particular types of programs. And if you make a judgment on what somebody is watching, you're very often making a judgment on them as well. So there's one particular, you may be familiar with it or not, there's one particular series, it's called The Royal Family. Now, it's a British, you're nodding your head, so you are familiar with it. Now, that took a while to be able to travel worldwide, because, and particularly in America, because there's no canned laughter. So in this series, people thought, myself included when I first saw it, that it was actually a documentary, because the camera style they use is similar to a fly-on-the-wall documentary. So if you like, you have a family, an ordinary family, and in this instance, they happen to be a Northern English working class family. And they sit watching telly every day. Nothing happens. It's all very banal. And the camera is almost positioned on the floor as if it's looking on at the family and recording their kind of chat and their you know, their various actions and so on and so forth. So it because of the type of devices that are used in this show, it looks like a documentary because some of the techniques are borrowed. Now, some people have heavily criticized this show, saying it's rude. It's, you know, because Jim is constantly the main character, the father in it is constantly burping and making rude noises and making smart comments about the toilet and so on and so forth. So many people turn away from this. And so in looking at a program like this, and they dismiss it, yet we have a family, in spite of all these kind of things that it's been criticized for, we have a family who actually sit down together and watch telly. So as you can see, you can interpret that in different ways, but also we have to ask ourselves in terms of representation, does this represent a typical Northern English working class family or not? And they're the kind of questions we ask ourselves. So is it real, and how real is it? Can anything on the media be real? And this is what representation opens up for us. We say the news is real. We see photographs. We say they're real. You know, this idea of seeing is believing, which kind of comes from Aristotle in a sense. You know, I see it, it's true. But in the media, remember, everything is constructed. So if you go back to your news, there can be hundreds and millions of stories coming down through the wire. But why are only 5 and 6 items selected? What's left out? And why are they left out? So again, in terms of representations, who do we get to see? How are they represented? How are, maybe you're familiar with Harry Potter. How are males and females represented in Harry Potter? Do we see kind of, you know, there's all different ways to be a boy, and there's all different ways to be a girl, and there's all different ways to be other. But who dominates, or who comes out on top in the media? Well, if we look at our various media texts, if we look at Harry Potter as an example, Harry is handsome, he's intelligent, he's sporty, he's adventurous, he wins the games, he gets the girl, So Harry is the most popular, and you're probably asking yourself, what is wrong with that? You know, he's all those things. But the problem with that is, if you have a constant portrayal of a boy being this way, young people reading this will assume that this is how I must be in the world. I should be sporty, I should be handsome, I should be gorgeous, and so on and so forth. So what happens to the rest of us? Because most of us are just ordinary. And the same way with females. What about those that are other gender in society? Think of is it The Little Mermaid? Yeah, The Little Mermaid. Have you seen The Little Mermaid? Do you know the character in it? Now, The Little Mermaid is happy to give up her legs or give up her voice to get legs, to get her prince and live happily ever after. What kind of message is this giving out? And Ursula, underworld Ursula, who is neither male or female, sounds like a man, looks like a woman, has a woman's name, so we don't know what she is. So she's other. But what happens to other in the film? She dies. She's killed off because there's only room for princesses. So that kind of representation, when you look even at Disney Pixar, think of Brave. Brave was kind of came out there from Pixar, and Disney. You know, Disney and Pixar are linked. You know that, like Disney owns so much text in the world, in all different forms. So if you think of young people looking at these constant representations of little girls, you know, must look beautiful, be beautiful in order to get their Prince Charming. What sort of effect does that have on society, on expectations? Because you know life is messy, there's ups and downs, there's moments of happiness, and there's moments of lots of other stuff. So if we're constantly looking at films and they're giving out a particular message, what does this say? And what impact does it have on, think of body image, how body image is represented in the media. There's I'm sure you're familiar with the eating disorder called anorexia. You're nodding your heads. Well, there are a few sites that promote an eating disorder as a lifestyle choice, as a lifestyle choice. So we don't want, I don't want to spoil the huge pleasure and the huge entertainment that we get from our media, because it provides us with company, it allows us to connect with friends, it allows us to escape, it allows us to fantasize, and sometimes it allows us to kind of act out our aggression, if you like, because sometimes films are a way of resolving contradictions in the world. In other words, think of, you know, even bring it down to your particular example. If you're having a difficulty in a relationship, and you know you're all confused and mixed up, and sometimes when you watch a program where you know where you maybe identify with a particular character who's going through something similar, this can be kind of work as a catharsis for us and help us to work out stuff. So media is good, but we need to be informed about how they construct the world for us. Does that make sense? I'm trying to include all types of media here to kind of cater for everybody. I totally agree. Okay. So that's what we do in representation. And even think of different places around the world. Like I remember visiting Canada once because my daughter was there as a student, and a program came on about Ireland. And it was as if we were all leprechauns. You know, this kind of, oh, I just, you know, stereotypical kind of person that was Irish, you know, it's like we were kind of all, I don't know how leprechaun is the best word I can think of. And there are, even today, I think there's another Irish film made in Ireland, although I think the director is American, and it's something Pine. But it's when I hear I went to see it recently, and I heard the accents of the Irish, of the actors, the put on Irish accent, and I don't hear that accent anywhere. I have no experience of that accent. So this is fun and it sounds like fun, but there's lots of kind of darker, you know, that has huge implications, as you can imagine, especially for people, you know, who have drug addictions. You know, a lot of people think that, you know, homeless people are all drug addicts. And a lot of people who are addicted to drugs are only seen as drug addicts. You know, that they're called drug addicts. They're seen as one-dimensional, whereas it's just a part of them. Okay, how am I doing for time? I don't want to be boring you.
Well, actually, we are running out of time.
Okay, so I'll kind of wrap it up. So all the areas I've only just touched into in terms of communication, in terms of the different kind of toolkit that we get in media studies. We look at semiotics, it helps us to analyze films. We look at representation, we look at genre, news photography, and we look at rhetoric. And of course, social media is very much part of that in terms of how we create narratives about ourselves. So that's what I do in the course. And I'm hoping today, I suppose, and I always hope this for my first lecture with students, that I create an awareness of how they communicate. So thank you very much to my audience. And I hope you got something
interesting.
Okay, good.
Yeah. It makes them think, definitely.
Okay, good. Well, I'll include some of the images on my slides.
I would like to thank you, Sarah. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. So it was so interesting to see how we are really influenced by everything we see all the time, right? From TV, social media, and I think you made a reflection really deep about how it can be harmful for everyone, right?
Yeah.
So it was really, really nice class. I hope everyone understood what you said, because it was really, really interesting. I like his deep reflections.
Okay, yeah. That's kind of the whole idea. That's what I do for the first lecture. You know, to kind of, yeah, and the students always enjoy it. You know, I can tell from their body language. Their body language communicates to me that they are enjoying the module.
Even if they don't really think about it, at least now they have another perspective. And they will see with different eyes, open eyes, right? So thank you very much. I was really enriching.
Okay, goodbye. And thank you very much too.
Thank you very much. I'll be sharing with the students later your slides, your presentation. So thank you so much, Karen. I will just have a little things to say to them, but you can leave if you want.
Anna, can I stay? No? Do you want me to leave? Will I leave?
Oh, it's up to you.